We're going to pick up in chapter 14. We did chapters 12 and 13 last week. The original plan today is 14, 15, and 16. And we'll just see. Not going to, like I said, not going to try to cram it all in. But we're going to look today at the Lamb, the harvest, and the 7 bowls. So after what we would say this dread that we've been seeing through chapters 12 and 13, where we were introduced to the great dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and then the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns, and the dragon gives the power to the beast. Chapter 14 opens with a vision of the Lamb on Mount Zion, surrounded by the 144,000 that we saw earlier in Revelation. And so the contrast here is deliberate, because as we've seen before, going through Revelation, we see dread and destruction, and then we see the heavenly temple and Jesus victorious. Then we see judgments again. Then we see a glimpse of heaven again. And it's not like these things are in order. It's here's what's going on in heaven while this is going on earth. So we've just seen the beast kingdom and all its apparent power and authority. And now we see the Lamb's kingdom in what we would say all its certain victory, the victory of the kingdom of the Lamb. And in chapter 14, we see the Lamb's announcement of judgment. And then in 15 is the preparation for the final outpouring of wrath. And then in chapter 16 is the execution of that wrath in the 7 bowl judgments, one bowl or vial after another being poured out of this judgment. And this judgment sequence is reaching the completion. We had the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls. 7 seals. The 7th seal opened up for the trumpets, and now we have the bowls, and it's like 21 outpourings of judgment, right? And so that culminates this specific part here in what we'll see today if we get to it. So the bowls are the full undiluted wrath of God poured out on God's covenant-breaking people. You remember what we looked at last week in the Sunday morning sermon? Jesus said, if it's your will that this cup pass from me, it's the cup of the wrath of God. That he, like I said, we don't want to bear our own wrath. We couldn't stand to bear the wrath due to us for our own sin. Well, Jesus bore the wrath due to all of us for all of our sin himself. And he drank every drop of it. But for those who don't trust in Christ, guess what they do? They drink the cup of the wrath of God. And so that's the wrath that's being poured out. So the first thing we see in part 1 is the Lamb and the 144,000 on Mount Zion. Chapter 14, I don't know how much of it we'll read. Let's read verses 1 through 5. Then I looked, and behold, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb, and with him 144,000 who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven, like the roar of many waters, and like the sound of loud thunder. The voice I heard was the sound of the harpists playing on their harps, and their singing was a new song before the throne and before the 4 living creatures and before the elders. No one could learn that song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. It is these who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins. It is these who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These have been redeemed from mankind as the first fruits for God and the Lamb. And in their mouth no lie was found, for they are blameless. So the contrast of this vision with chapter 13 is important to see. We see the contrast between these two. The beast has marked his people in the previous chapter, but here the Lamb has marked his people. It's so funny when people freak out and try to worry about what the mark of the beast might be on the forehead and the hand. Well, in the very next chapter, you see God's people are marked. And nobody freaks out about that. What is that? Is that a microchip? It's a mark of allegiance, right? Those who are giving their allegiance to the beast and to the dragon, and those who are giving their allegiance to the Lamb. And so the beast stood on the sand of the sea, but the Lamb stands on Mount Zion, which is the covenant mountain, the dwelling place of God, the place of ultimate security and permanence. And Mount Zion, if you read through the Old Testament, you see that it is often depicted as the place of eschatological gathering, like end gathering of God's people. And I may have the passages there for you, but like Isaiah 24, Joel 2, Obadiah verse 17, Micah chapter 4. It's the mountain of the Lord where the remnant is saved, where the nations stream, where God reigns. And so John puts the lamb there deliberately. It's in the vision, and he records it as the lamb is there deliberately. So whatever Rome has done, whatever apostate Jerusalem has done, the lamb is still standing. And whatever the beast demanded, whatever the beast has demanded, the lamb's people bear his name. And we see there's a new song. A new song is the song of redemption, and only the redeemed know it. And it cannot be learned secondhand. It's a song that only the redeemed can sing. And the character of these people who we are calling the remnant, right? The people who are preserved from this wrath. They are described as those who have not defiled themselves with women, that they are virgins. They follow the Lamb wherever he goes. They were purchased from among men as first fruits, and no lie was found in their mouth. They are blameless. There's a theme that runs through the Old Testament pretty often, and it is God has chosen Israel to be his people. Jerusalem is the headquarters, is the capital. That's his people. And if you read the Old Testament, what do you see? You see Jerusalem constantly betraying God, constantly going after other gods. And this is why consistently, several times throughout the Old Testament, Scripture through the prophet, God through the prophets refers to Israel, the northern kingdom, Judah, the southern kingdom, Jerusalem, Samaria, the capital cities, as harlots. Because God is their husband. God has married his people. And they say, we don't want you. We want Egypt and what Egypt has to offer. We want Egypt's gods. We want Babylon and what Babylon has to offer. We want the Medo-Persian Empire and what they have to offer. We'll run to Assyria for safety. You know what? Yahweh's not doing what we want him to do. We're going to worship Baal. We're going to sacrifice some of our children to Molech. That is what Israel does all the time through the Old Testament. You read the story of the kings. Some of the kings, all of Israel's kings were wicked to one degree or another, but the southern kingdom, Judah, it would like flip-flop. You'd have a pretty good king, and then his son would be wicked. And then his son would be good and tear down all the idols. Then his son would rebuild the idols. And they would constantly worship other gods. Well, the remnant people here talked about are those who have preserved themselves and kept, in the John's vision, they've kept themselves from women, right? They are chaste, they are pure, devoted to the Lamb. It would be like those people during it'd be like a Jeremiah, right? A Jeremiah during the Babylonian captivity when people had been worshiping other gods. That was part of what brought them into captivity. But Jeremiah said, I'm not doing it. I'm not worshiping other gods. It would be like Elijah with the prophets of Baal. There were 450 false prophets, and Elijah felt like he was the only one. Elijah felt like I'm the only prophet left, and God said, nope, I've reserved for myself 7,000 who have not bowed their knee to Baal. They're not worshiping Baal. They're my prophets. They were the remnant, and they had not cheated on God. They had been faithful to God, and that's who these people are. They've got the seal of God on their foreheads, and they've been faithful to God. That's what the 144,000 here have done. They've kept the testimony of Jesus in a world that demanded they bow to Caesar. They bow to whatever. They've kept the testimony. And the first fruits language is significant too, because first fruits in the Old Testament are the initial offering that consecrates and anticipates the full harvest. So the 144,000 that are pictured are the first fruits that point toward the innumerable multitude that we also see in chapter 7. And so the 144,000 are the beginning of the full harvest. And now, moving on in part 2, we see the 3 angels. And there are 3 angels that fly in sequence, and they each carry a message that frames the judgments to come. And in verses 6 through 7, maybe I won't read it all, but in verses 6 through 7, we have the first angel who has the eternal gospel. And he said in verse 7, fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. And worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea, and the springs of water. So here's the last phase of judgments with these 7 bowl judgments, and the angel announces these judgments coming. And then we see in verses 6 through 7, if I've got that right. Yeah, that's the angel with the eternal gospel. In verses 8, we have another angel, a second, followed, saying, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, she who made all nations drink the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality. So what did we just see about those who were preserved? They were called virgins. They had not defiled themselves. They were chaste and they were devoted to the Lamb. The 144,000 had the seal of God. But here, judgment has fallen on Babylon the Great, who made all nations drink the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality. Babylon the Great right here is not Rome. That description sounds nothing like Rome. That description sounds everything like Israel, like Jerusalem. That's exactly what she has done. She has been the harlot who has who's given herself to Egypt and to Assyria and to Babylon and to now to Rome. We're going to see this probably today, not today, probably next week, where Jesus is on trial before Pilate, and he asked the people, what do you want us to do with your king, Jesus? And they said, we have no king but Caesar. Right? So they've rejected their Messiah and said, Caesar of Rome, the emperor of Rome is our king. And so Jerusalem is doing what she has always consistently done. And so Babylon now is fallen. And Babylon here is the one who has historically given herself to all these other nations. And Babylon, the double fallen language comes from Isaiah 21:9, the announcement of the fall of historical Babylon. And so John is using the name Babylon as he uses it throughout as Jerusalem, and apostate Jerusalem that has abandoned her God. And so the announcement comes before the bowls are poured out. The verdict has been declared, and now it's just carrying out the verdict. Now, what is the sentence? What is the punishment here? And so the third angel, we see the warning against the mark in verses 9 through 12. Another angel, a third, following them, saying with a loud voice, if anyone worships the beast and its image and receives a mark on his forehead or on his hand, he also will drink the wine of God's wrath, poured full strength into the cup of his anger, and he will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever, and they have no rest, day or night, these worshipers of the beast and its image, and whoever receives the mark of his name. Verse 12, here is a call for the endurance of the saints, those who keep the commandments of God and their faith in Jesus. And I heard a voice from heaven saying, write this, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Blessed indeed, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow them. So we have this warning about the judgment that's falling on apostate Jerusalem that John is calling Babylon. And anyone who takes the mark, whatever this mark would be, are also going to drink of that wrath. And if you remember that this is about Jerusalem, and it's about Rome surrounding Jerusalem, going to attack Jerusalem. And if Jerusalem submits to Rome, says, we are sorry, we don't mean to revolt, we take it back, we don't revolt anymore, we submit, then they're giving their allegiance to Rome. But the factions inside, you also have those who said, no, we're staying with the temple. God's not going to abandon us. Yes, we crucified this Jesus fella, 30, 40 years ago, but God is not going to abandon us. We're staying with the temple. And that brought on the wrath of God, right? That brought God's wrath because, for one, Revelation identifies the wrath as the wrath of the Lamb. The one that they crucified is now pouring wrath out on them through the attack of Rome, and then through, of course, them attacking themselves, turning on themselves. But this is an amazing verse 13. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. what had happened with those who had died in the Lord up to this point? We saw them under the altar, the martyrs under the altar, saying, "How much longer, God, till you vindicate us?" And it was those who were, from Abel to Zechariah. It was Jeremiah. It was Ezekiel. It was the prophets of old who had died as prophets of God, as being faithful to God, but not being vindicated. And they're saying, "How much longer until you vindicate us, until you make these things right?" The author of Hebrews in chapter 11, when he identifies all these people who were tortured, they're sawn in two, they went around in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute and all that. He said, "Of whom the world was not worthy. Yet God," how's he say it? I'm trying to remember. They're not perfect without us, because God has something more for us. So he's talking about those from the old covenant and those in the new covenant. So those in the old covenant, there was a sense in which they died without vindication. They died, they rested in God, right? That's where they were. But the picture in Revelation is that they're under the altar crying out, "How much longer?" Well, as we saw last week, and I guess maybe the week before, now is the time, right? No longer. The wait is over. And so now, after this judgment's poured out, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. So that's something unique. When we die now as Christians, there's something unique for us that was not for Jeremiah and Ezekiel when they died in the old covenant. Now we're dying in the new covenant. Now, of course, they died being made right with God based on the future sacrifice of Christ, right? They were saved because of their faith in the promises of God and the coming Messiah. When the Messiah comes and wrath is executed on him in place of their sin and on him in place of our sin, there's something different and special after the cross dealing with our salvation, right? There's no vindication left, right? We have been vindicated as far as that goes in the work of Christ. So blessed are the dead who die going forward. Death in the Lord is not loss. It is rest and it is vindication. It is the threshold of reward. So for a congregation like these 7 churches this letter goes to, they were facing Neronian persecution under Emperor Nero. And it was an encouragement for them to keep going, to stand under the persecution, because vindication was happening at that very moment, and they would die in that position of dying in the new covenant, if that kind of makes sense. We're also understanding this from the perspective of an apocalyptic revelation. So the heart that, Paul died being vindicated, right? Even though Paul died before all this happened. So we're seeing the things that are taking place between the old and the new covenant. And let's just cover part 3, and we will save part 4 and 5 for next week. I don't want to get bogged down and don't want to go too fast. So part 3, we see the harvest of the earth in verses 14 through 20. Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and seated on the cloud, one like a son of man with a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. And another angel came out of the temple, calling with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, "Put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is fully ripe." So he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle across the earth, and the earth was reaped. Then another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. And another angel came out from the altar, the angel who has authority over the fire, and he called with a loud voice to the one who had the sharp sickle, "Put in your sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth." So it's like a second harvest, right? "For its grapes are ripe." So the angel swung his sickle across the earth and gathered the grape harvest and the earth and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city. The blood and blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle for 1,600 stadia. That's a long way. So we see a grain harvest, and then we see a grape harvest. The grain harvest in prophetic literature can represent either salvation or judgment. Joel 3 uses harvest language for judgment, but Matthew, in Matthew 13:39, uses it as the gathering of the righteous at the end of the age. And so the best reading is that this is the harvest gathering of God's people, the reaping of the first fruits into the barn. And so if that's the case, then it stands in contrast with the grape harvest. So the grain harvest has been got, has been collected, has been brought in. Now there's another harvest, and it's the harvest of the grapes. And the winepress imagery is drawn from Isaiah 63, where God treads the winepress of his wrath, and the nation's lifeblood splatters his garments. That's the picture, as he's treading on the, I mean, that's how they made wine in ancient times. I mean, it sounds kind of disgusting, but they stomped on it, smushed it, and it got all over them. And the image is God stomping in his wrath and the blood splattering. That's the image. And that's what we see in Isaiah 63. But the 1600 stadia is almost certainly symbolic. It's 40 square, or 4 times 400. So it's one of those symbolic numbers. And it's also interesting to note that that distance of 1600 stadia is roughly the length of the land of Israel from the north to the south. So it suggests that this judgment is geographically specific. God's judging his covenant-breaking people. And some trip over this. I may have said this in the class already, about God keeping his covenant. God said he would never break his covenant with Israel. This shows that he didn't. What's the covenant, right? If you keep on doing this, I'm going to keep on pouring my wrath out on you. And for a couple of millennia, they keep on rebelling, keep on turning, and ultimately they kill the son. And he says, okay, I'm going to come, I'm going to kill the wicked tenants and give the vineyard to those who will bear fruit. And so when God judges his covenant-breaking people, he's actually keeping his covenant. If he doesn't judge them, then he's breaking his covenant, because he's doing exactly what he said that he would do. The blood reaching the horses' bridles, it echoes first Enoch, and is hyperbolic or exaggeratory language, apocalyptic language for catastrophic bloodshed. If someone believes this is yet to happen in the future, or if someone sees it like we do, as having already happened, then in both cases you understand it's symbolic, right? It's not saying that there's enough bloodshed that it's this high, right? That's ridiculous. But the blood being shed that's up to the horse's bridle, that's intense bloodshed, right? That's a lot of the wrath of God. That is stomping some grapes, right? You stomp the grapes until it flows up above your head. So that's the imagery. It flows so high, it's up to the horse's bridle. And this kind of bloodshed is the kind that Josephus, of course, describes in detail throughout his wars, books 5 and 6. So Josephus, not a Christian, a Jewish historian, writes about the destruction of Jerusalem. And you can read Josephus and the book of Revelation, or Matthew 24, or Mark 13, and Luke 22, side by side, and you're like, good grief. It's like they're copying off of each other because of the imagery that Jesus predicts on the Olivet Discourse and John sees here in his Revelation. And then a few years later, Josephus records the literal events happening in Jerusalem.